My name is Leo Vance, and I'm 29 years old. I'm the founder of Vance Capital, an investment fund managing a portfolio of around $30 million. I live in Colorado, a place of staggering mountain ranges and crystalline lakes that can feel like a slice of heaven. This is my home, the land that holds not just my fondest memories but also my deepest, most formative wounds. I am the son of a celebrated lawyer, a man whose name commands respect throughout the city of Denver. But to me, he's no hero. He is an immense shadow that has eclipsed my life for as long as I can remember. And then there is my twin brother, Julian. He is the person I love with a fierce loyalty and yet resent with a bitter ache. Someone I feel a desperate need to protect and an equally powerful urge to overcome. My story is one of fighting for my own ground, navigating a landscape of love, profound injustice, and the brutal lessons that only a family can teach. I was born into a life that, from the outside, looked absolutely flawless. My father, Marcus Vance, is a legal genius who clawed his way up from nothing to build an empire of law. In the bleak landscape of my family life, Clara was a sudden, brilliant ray of light. We met by chance in a small coffee shop downtown, a collision of spilled lattes and apologies that turned into hours of conversation. She was a painter, and she saw the world in vibrant colors and textures that I, lost in the grayscale of finance and family pressure, had forgotten existed. Clara saw me, not Leo Vance, son of the great Marcus Vance, but just Leo. She found value in my thoughts and my quiet moments, not in my pedigree. Her presence was a balm, a warm and steadying force that made me believe for the first time that I could be loved for who I was, separate from the suffocating weight of my last name. That belief was shattered toward the end of 2018. It started with a phone call from Julian. His voice was strained, urgent. He told me about a major investment project he was working on, a deal with a company called Albright Industries. He said he was in over his head and desperately needed my expertise to analyze the company's financials. A knot of suspicion tightened in my gut, but the plea in his voice, the familiar sound of my twin needing me, overrode it. I pushed my own work aside and spent 2 sleepless nights poring over the data, building a comprehensive investment strategy for him. I sent him the completed file, feeling the quiet satisfaction of having helped him. 2 days later, my world tilted on its axis. An article flashed across my screen announcing a successful merger. My father's firm had just acquired a 10% stake in Albright Industries, a move that solidified his dominance in the market. The architect of the deal, my father, Marcus Vance. The analytical report cited in the press release, it was mine. Every word, every number. My blood ran cold. He hadn't just used me, he had turned my own skill, my own labor into a weapon for our father's victory. The humiliation was a physical force, leaving me breathless. My brother, my own flesh and blood, had orchestrated the entire deception. I drove to my father's office, my hands shaking with a rage so potent it felt like a sickness. I stormed past his secretary and found him sitting behind his enormous mahogany desk, a smug smile playing on his lips. When I confronted him, placing the printout of the article on his desk, he just leaned back in his leather chair, completely unfazed. He looked at me not with the eyes of a father, but with the cold appraisal of a victor. "This is a lesson, Leo," he said, his voice smooth and cutting. "The world is a battlefield and you're still too naive, too sentimental. Julian understands. He knows what it takes to win." The words struck me harder than a physical blow. I was just a pawn in his game, a tool to be used and discarded. I walked out of that monument to his ego feeling hollowed out, as if he had scooped out the very core of my identity. The shame was a poison that seeped into everything. I couldn't bear to look at Clara. Couldn't stand the thought of her seeing me as this pathetic, manipulated fool. The confidence she had so carefully helped me build had crumbled to dust. I started pushing her away, manufacturing arguments, becoming cold and distant. I watched the confusion and pain grow in her eyes, and every flicker of it felt like a fresh failure. One evening I ended it. I delivered the words with a mechanical coldness that cost me everything. Watching the light in her go out, the sound of my apartment door clicking shut behind her was the sound of my own world ending. I stood in the silence for a long time, a ghost in the life we were supposed to build. The weeks that followed were a gray, featureless blur. I locked myself away, ignoring calls from friends, letting my work at the fund drift. I felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of betrayal and self-loathing. Then one afternoon a letter arrived. It was from my grandmother. The paper felt delicate in my hands, covered in her familiar, elegant script. She didn't mention the deal or my father. She just wrote about the changing seasons at her lakeside cabin and asked me to come for Christmas. "The pines are waiting for you," she wrote, "and so am I." Her simple, unconditional love was the first genuine warmth I had felt in months. It was a lifeline, and I grabbed hold of it. I arrived at my grandmother's cabin on the morning of December 24th. The air was crisp and clean, and the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the small, cozy space. For a day, there was a fragile peace. Then at 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, Julian showed up. The moment I saw him standing in the doorway, the rage I had suppressed came roaring back to life. We stood there, facing each other in the quiet living room. The cheerful glow of the Christmas tree, a bizarre backdrop to the storm brewing between us. I asked him why. My voice was dangerously low. He started to stammer out an apology, but the words felt cheap, hollow. The fury inside me broke its leash. I lunged forward and shoved him hard against the wall. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell. For a second, I think we were both just boys again, ready to trade blows in the backyard. Before it could escalate, our grandmother stepped between us, her presence more powerful than any physical force. She simply looked at us, her eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness, and the fight drained out of me. It was then, in the heavy silence, that Julian finally broke. His shoulders slumped, and the whole story came pouring out of him in a torrent of pained, fractured sentences. He told me he hadn't wanted to do it. But our father had discovered that Julian's son Ethan had a rare genetic disorder requiring incredibly expensive long-term care. The treatments weren't fully covered by insurance. Marcus had given Julian an ultimatum: either help him orchestrate the deal to use my analysis to outmaneuver a rival, Mr. Davies, or he would personally ensure every penny of financial support for his grandson's medical future was cut off. He had threatened his own son's child. Julian had also been diagnosed with a severe heart condition months earlier, a fact he'd hidden from everyone. He was terrified, exhausted, and felt he had no choice but to sacrifice me to save his son. The anger inside me evaporated, replaced by a wave of ice-cold horror. The whole narrative of my life, the one where I was the victim and he was the villain, shattered into a million pieces. He wasn't my rival. He was a desperate father and a sick man, trapped by a monster we both called Dad. All the resentment I'd held onto vanished, leaving only a profound, aching grief for both of us. I pulled him into a hug, and for the first time in years, we weren't competitors. We were just brothers, holding each other up against the wreckage our father had made of our lives. A few days later, my heart pounding, I called Clara. My voice shook as I asked if she would be willing to just talk. I needed to explain. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she agreed to meet. I laid everything bare, the whole ugly, complicated story about my father, my brother, and my own crushing shame. She listened without judgment, her gaze soft with an empathy I felt I didn't deserve. She told me she had a daughter, Chloe, from a past relationship, and that she understood the fierce, sometimes terrifying instinct to protect a child at any cost. The next week, I walked back into my father's office. This time, there was no rage, only a quiet, resolute calm. I wasn't there to fight. I was there to quit. I told him I was leaving the family, that I would no longer be a piece on his board. I looked at this man so powerful and so utterly alone in his self-made kingdom, and for the first time I felt not fear or anger, but a distant pity. He had all the success in the world, but he had no love. He had lost his sons. I walked out of that building and didn't look back. My path was my own now, no longer defined by his shadow or my race against Julian. It was a path leading back to my brother, back to Clara, and finally back to myself. His law firm is one of the biggest in the state, a legal fortress that serves the titans of industry and the most influential figures in politics. My father is a tall man with a voice that can be both resonant and profoundly unsettling, a warm baritone that can turn to ice in an instant. But it's his eyes that I remember most, always scanning, always assessing, as if he were constantly measuring the worth and weakness of everyone and everyone in his orbit. You learn very quickly not to cross him in an argument. He possessed a terrifying ability to dismantle your logic, twisting your own words until you felt foolish and insignificant, shrinking under his gaze. My entire life was lived in the shade of his immense reputation, a place where every achievement and every choice felt provisional, waiting for his final critical stamp of approval. My mother, Catherine, is a different kind of force, one of quiet strength and profound gentleness. Before she married my father, she was the heir to a prominent Boston family, with a future of her own design laid out before her. She set aside all of her own ambitions to become a wife and mother, dedicating herself to being the emotional core of our household. She has hair the color of pale gold and deep blue eyes that seem to hold a perpetual warmth, a stark contrast to my father's cold scrutiny. Her smile was my sanctuary. It had the power to quiet the anxieties that raged inside me. My mother's love for Julian and me was absolute, a constant and unconditional presence in our lives. Yet I could always see the quiet pain flicker in her expression when she was caught in the crossfire of my father's expectations and my own resistance. It was a helplessness that showed in the slight tremor of her hand, a silent plea for a peace she could never fully broker. She did her best to be a bridge, to span the growing distance between us, but the fractures in our family ran like fault lines, far too deep and volatile for anyone to mend. Julian, my twin brother, is somehow a completely different soul from me, even though we were born with identical faces. He is my reflection and my opposite all at once. His light brown hair is always immaculately styled, and he possesses a smile that feels like a sudden ray of sunshine capable of disarming anyone. He has a gift for language, a way of speaking that wraps around you and makes you feel like the only person in the room. Julian navigates the world with a politician's charm, an innate diplomacy that allows him to always know what people need to hear. This made him our father's clear favorite, not just because of his easygoing nature, but because Julian understood on a primal level how to make our father feel proud. I, however, am wired for directness, often to the point of being blunt. I could never stop myself from confronting my father when I felt he was wrong. It's no surprise that he and I were like two opposing magnetic poles, caught in a state of perpetual, exhausting repulsion. Our home was a sprawling mansion in an exclusive enclave of Cherry Hills Village, a monument of glass and steel overlooking a small, glistening lake. The floor-to-ceiling windows left us feeling perpetually on display. Inside, every object was a statement of luxury and wealth, a cold testament to my father's ambition. The space was immaculate, but it was a house, not a home, filled with expensive things but devoid of any real comfort. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, The walls were hung with expensive, abstract art, and the air carried the faint, cloying scent of my mother's designer perfume. It was perfect. But for me, that house never felt like a home. It was more like a meticulously designed stage where each of us had a part to play in the grand performance of the Vance family. And I was always the one who missed my cues, the discordant note in an otherwise flawless production. When we were little, Julian and I were two halves of a single whole, completely inseparable. We spent our days creating imaginary worlds in the sprawling backyard, building elaborate forts by the edge of the lake, whispering our dreams of grand adventures into the dark. But as we got older, the subtle differences between us began to sharpen into stark contrasts. I watched as Julian effortlessly learned how to draw a laugh from our father, how to make our mother beam with pride, how to win the easy affection of everyone he met. He had a natural talent for it, delivering a perfect joke or a sweet compliment with a sincerity that could melt even the most cynical heart. I couldn't do that. It wasn't in me. I always felt compelled to speak the truth even when it was difficult, even when I knew it would cause pain. My directness was a constant source of friction. My father saw it as stubborn defiance, a willful refusal to play the game. I saw it as integrity. It was a fundamental disagreement that defined our relationship, a chasm that only grew wider with every passing year. I must have been about 10 years old when my father hosted one of his grand parties, filling our house with powerful business partners. The air was thick with the booming laughter of men in expensive suits and the constant clinking of ice in whiskey glasses. Julian moved through the crowd like he was born to it, shaking hands, deploying that perfect, easy smile, and sharing some charming anecdote he'd probably overheard. I watched them roar with appreciation, clapping him on the back and telling my father what an impressive young man he was raising. Meanwhile, I had found a quiet armchair in the corner, escaping into a world that felt more real and honest than the forced pleasantries filling the room. A library book about the stock market. His shadow fell over my page before I even heard him approach. His voice was low, laced with that familiar sharp edge of disappointment. "Leo, what are you doing? Get out there and talk to people. Are you planning to hide in this corner all night like some kind of recluse?" I looked up from the page, my eyes meeting his. "I don't like pretending, Dad," I said, the words feeling small but true. He just gave a slow shake of his head, a gesture of complete dismissal, and walked away. A hot, tight knot of shame clenched in my chest. It was my mother, as always, who understood. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the house had fallen into a heavy silence, she found me still curled up on the living room sofa. She sat down beside me, her presence a quiet comfort in the cavernous room, and gently ran her fingers through my hair. "You don't have to be like anyone else, Leo," she whispered, her voice soft. "You are exactly who you are meant to be, and I love that person." Her words were a shield, the only approval I ever really needed. Her words were a tiny, flickering flame, just enough to warm my heart through the long, cold winters of my father's disapproval. But no matter how hard she tried to protect me, I couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in my own home, a stranger at my own family's table. My happiest memories weren't forged in that opulent house, but in the rustic simplicity of my grandparents' small log cabin, nestled near the immense forests of northern Colorado. My grandfather, Thomas, had been a park ranger his whole life, a tall, weathered man with hands roughened by hard work and a smile that radiated pure warmth. His hair was a shock of silver white, and his bright, clear eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of the mountains themselves. He loved me not for any talent or charm I might possess, but because he recognized a piece of himself in my spirit, a core of strength, a commitment to honesty, and more than a little stubbornness. Every summer, Julian and I were sent to stay with our grandparents for a few weeks. For me, those weeks were nothing short of paradise. I'd wake up with the sun, the air crisp and smelling of pine, and follow my grandfather deep into the woods. He was the one who taught me how to read the landscape, how to identify the different trees by their bark and leaves, how to listen to the whispers of the wind, and most importantly, how to find my way back when I was lost. He would tell me stories as we walked, tales of the ancient forest, of solitary mountain lions, and of men who had to fight their own internal wars to find their purpose in the world. "Leo," he told me once, his hand resting on my shoulder as we looked out over a vast, sun-dappled valley. "Life is a lot like this forest. There will be times you feel completely lost when the path disappears. But if you hold on to what's true in your heart, you will always find your way back to the light." Julian, however, never shared my love for the wilderness. He found the woods boring and uncomfortable. He much preferred staying inside the cabin, playing long strategic games of chess with our grandmother or entertaining her for hours with his seemingly endless supply of funny stories. He knew exactly how to make her laugh until her eyes crinkled at the corners, and I couldn't blame him for choosing that easy warmth. But sometimes, a sharp pang of jealousy would strike me. Julian seemed to earn people's love so effortlessly, while I felt like I was in a constant battle just to be seen and accepted for who I was. My grandmother, Eleanor, was a petite woman with a spirit as resilient as the mountains she lived in. She always wore her hair pinned up in a neat bun, and her warm brown eyes held a deep well of kindness. Her voice was as soft and soothing as a lullaby. She loved both of us dearly, but I always knew she worried about me more. "Leo, you have such a big heart," she told me once, her hand cupping my cheek. "But you must learn how to protect it. Not everyone in this world will understand you." Her words felt less like advice and more like a prophecy, because as I grew older, I came to realize with painful clarity that my own family was not a place where I would ever find peace. The year Julian and I turned 15, the tension between my father and me pulled taut, threatening to snap. It finally happened one evening during a family dinner. In the middle of a stilted conversation, my father cleared his throat and made an announcement. He had decided, he said, that we would be attending a prestigious boarding school on the East Coast that fall. I pushed my chair back from the table. The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. "I don't want to go to Boston, Dad. I want to stay here near Grandma and Grandpa, near Mom." My father's gaze turned glacial. "Leo, it's time you learn to live in the real world," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You can't spend your life as some dreamy kid hiding in the woods." My hand tightened around my steak knife, my knuckles turning white as I fought to control the hot surge of anger. "I'm not dreaming," I said through gritted teeth. "I just want to live a life that's actually mine." As he always did, Julian jumped in to defuse the situation. "Dad, I think the school sounds like a great opportunity for both of us," he said smoothly, a placating smile on his face. "Leo just needs some time to get used to the idea." He shot me a look that was meant to be reassuring, but all I saw was a performance. I knew in my gut that Julian couldn't have cared less about the boarding school. His only objective was to please our father, to be the good son once again. The betrayal felt sharp and immediate. My mother laid her hand gently on my shoulder, her touch a familiar comfort. "Everything will be all right, Leo," she whispered. But I knew with a chilling certainty that nothing was all right. In the end, I didn't have to go to Boston. My mother, in her quiet, persistent way, managed to convince my father to let me stay. But the victory came at a cost. From that day forward, the already frayed connection between my father and me deteriorated completely. When he looked at me, all I could see was disappointment. I was a failure in his eyes, the son who would never live up to his monumental expectations. Julian, on the other hand, ascended even higher in our father's estimation. He became the living embodiment of my father's pride, his golden child, while I became a constant irritating reminder of defiance, a thorn in his side. When we turned 18, Julian and I were both accepted into a top-tier economics program at the University of Denver. It felt like a significant turning point, a chance to finally carve out my own space. But it also brought a stark realization that the road ahead was going to be a solitary one. My father agreed to cover the tuition for both of us, but he pulled me aside before we left. The words he spoke to me that day are seared into my memory. "Leo," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "I will not be holding your hand through this like I will for Julian. If you want to prove your worth, you will do it entirely on your own." His words were meant to wound me, and they did, cutting deeper than he could ever know. But beneath the pain, they ignited something else, a cold, hard fire of determination. Right then, I made a silent vow. I would not rely on my father for anything. I would build my own future brick by brick, and one day he would be forced to look at me with something other than disappointment. One day he would look at me with respect. In the fall of my 18th year, I walked onto the campus of the University of Denver, a prestigious institution where grand dreams were nurtured and fierce ambitions were forged. The sprawling grounds, with their historic ivy-covered buildings, cobblestone walkways shaded by ancient oak trees, and an atmosphere humming with the electric energy of youth, felt like more than just a place of learning. For me, it was a battleground, a place where I would finally prove my own value. Julian enrolled alongside me, and though we had once been two sides of the same coin, I understood that from this moment forward we would be walking entirely separate paths. Our father covered the tuition for both of us, but that was where his support for me ended. Julian, however, was given a generous monthly allowance, a brand new car to make commuting easy, and a carefully curated list of introductions to our father's powerful business contacts. I was on my own. "Julian needs relationships to succeed," my father stated during a family dinner, his tone casual as if he were discussing the weather. It was a self-evident fact. I sat across the long, polished table from him, my hand clenched around my water glass, fighting back the familiar surge of hot anger. "What about me, Dad?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. He looked over at me, his expression flat, his eyes cold. "What is it you want, Leo? I've paid your tuition, don't ask for more." Beneath the table, my mother placed a hand on my leg, a silent, desperate gesture of solidarity. But her quiet comfort couldn't erase the profound sense of being utterly abandoned. I knew, with absolute certainty, that my father had no faith in my ability to succeed. In his mind, I was too rigid, too idealistic, too stubborn, and lacked the ruthless savvy required to survive in the cutthroat world of business. And in that moment, I became more determined than ever to prove him wrong. I started my university journey with a completely different mindset than Julian. While he immediately immersed himself in the social scene, joining student clubs, attending every party, and diligently building a network of potentially useful connections, I dove headfirst into my studies and took on a series of part-time jobs. My life became a relentless cycle of lectures, library sessions, and late-night shifts. I found work in the campus library, a quiet job shelving books and helping other students track down research materials. It was far from glamorous, and the meager pay barely covered my groceries and textbooks. But it gave me something far more valuable: a sense of independence. I didn't have to ask my father for a single dollar. I didn't have to bow my head to anyone. Every evening after my shift, I would find a quiet carrel in the back of the library and lose myself in books about the stock market, financial analysis, and complex investment strategies. Numbers, charts, and market fluctuations became my private world, a logical and predictable place where I was in control, a place where no one judged me. Julian, by contrast, was living a much more brilliant and visible life. He quickly became a prominent figure in several student organizations, a fixture at important campus events, and was even handpicked by a renowned economics professor to serve as his research assistant. I would often hear people whispering his name in the hallways as I passed. "Julian Vance is a natural," they'd say. "He's going to be huge." Every time I heard those words, a complicated knot of pride and bitterness would tighten in my gut. Pride because no matter what, Julian was my brother. But the bitterness was there too, a sharp and undeniable sting. I knew that a significant part of his success was built on the foundation of our father's support and his own innate charm, a gift I simply did not possess. One evening during the winter of our freshman year, Julian and I ended up sitting across from each other at a small table in the campus cafeteria. Outside, a thick blanket of snow was falling, muffling the world in white. Julian was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater, a recent gift from our father, while I was bundled in my old frayed jacket. He looked at me and flashed that familiar, easy smile. "Leo, you should really join the Young Entrepreneurs Club with me," he said. "There are some really impressive people in the group. They could be helpful to you down the road." I took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee. "I don't need those kinds of connections, Julian," I replied, my voice flat. "I want to build this on my own." He just shrugged, his smile never faltering. "You've always been so stubborn," he said lightly. "I'm just trying to look out for you." I knew on some level that he probably didn't mean any harm, but his words still felt like a dismissive slap in the face. He would never understand. He couldn't see that I didn't want to walk his path, the one our father had so carefully paved for him, where every step was easier. I needed to carve my own trail, no matter how difficult or unforgiving the terrain might be. During my sophomore year, I took the small amount of money I had painstakingly saved from my library job and began investing in the stock market. I opened an online trading account and devoted every spare hour to the craft, poring over quarterly reports, analyzing market data, and trying to anticipate future trends. The first time I clicked the buy button, my heart hammered against my ribs. It felt like I was gambling with my entire future. I put my faith in a small, obscure tech company, convinced that their innovative product was poised for a breakthrough. 3 months later, the stock had doubled in value. I sold my shares and made a profit of $500. It wasn't a life-changing sum by any means, but to me it felt monumental. It was my first real victory, tangible proof that I could accomplish something completely on my own, without a shred of my father's influence or money. Meanwhile, Julian was focused on building his personal brand. He partnered up with a group of wealthy friends on a startup venture, developing a new app designed to connect small businesses with angel investors. It was a flashy project, perfectly suited to his talents for networking and presentation. I was playing a different game, a quieter one, but I was finally on the board. Our father, of course, provided the initial seed capital for their venture. I heard from my mother that he even retained a legal advisor from his own firm to help Julian and his partners refine their business plan. The news didn't surprise me, but it still carried a familiar sting. My father never once asked me about what I was doing, never showed a flicker of interest in my growing passion for the market. In his eyes, I was still just the stubborn, wayward son, an investment with no potential for return. My mother was the only one who consistently stood in my corner. Every weekend when I came home for the obligatory family dinner, she would find a moment to pull me aside, away from my father's critical gaze. One Sunday, she pressed a container of homemade cookies into my hands, her eyes shining with genuine pride. "Leo," she said softly, "I heard you've started investing. That's wonderful. You're doing so well, my son." A real smile broke through my carefully constructed defenses, and a wave of warmth spread through my chest. "I'm just trying things out, Mom," I admitted. I'm not great at it yet." She squeezed my hand, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to be great right now. You just need to keep being you. I believe in you, Leo. I know you're going to do incredible things." Her unwavering faith was like a fresh wind, blowing away the persistent clouds of self-doubt. My father, however, was a different story. One evening, when I made the mistake of casually mentioning a successful stock trade during dinner, he scoffed dismissively. "Stocks?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You really think you can beat the market, Leo? It's a gambler's game, not a playground for stubborn kids like you." My fists clenched into tight knots under the table. I focused on keeping my voice even. "I'm not gambling, Dad. I do my research, I analyze the data, I know what I'm doing." He stared at me, his gaze so cold it was almost physical. "What could you possibly know? You're young and arrogant. When you lose it all, don't come crying to me to bail you out." My mother tried to intervene, her voice strained with worry. "Marcus, Leo is trying his best. You should be supporting him." But my father simply shook his head, already turning his full attention to Julian, asking about the progress of his app, as if I had vanished from the room entirely. In that moment, a painful truth crystallized inside me. I wasn't just fighting to prove myself to the world. I was in a constant battle against my own father's profound and unshakable doubt. He didn't believe in me, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he probably never would. But instead of letting that crushing weight drag me down, I felt it transform into something else, a hard, sharp-edged motivation. I swore to myself that I would succeed, not to finally win his approval, but to prove, once and for all, that I didn't need it to become the man I was meant to be. By the time I was a junior, my quiet efforts in the market were beginning to yield small but consistent successes. I had managed to build a stock portfolio worth around $5,000, almost entirely from the profits of my earlier trades. I also finally worked up the courage to join an investment club at school, a place where I could learn from other students and share my own growing knowledge. For the first time in my life, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. It was a community where people respected me for my abilities, not for my last name or my family's connections. A professor who advised the club, a man named Mr. Peterson, started to notice my potential. One afternoon, he called me into his office. He handed me a thick, well-worn book on the principles of value investing. "Leo, you have excellent instincts," he told me, his eyes kind but serious. "But to truly succeed in this game, you need patience. Don't ever let your emotions drive your decisions." I nodded, a profound sense of gratitude washing over me. I felt like I had finally found a mentor, someone who saw my potential without judgment. Meanwhile, Julian's star continued its brilliant ascent. His startup had captured the attention of a local venture capital fund, and soon he was featured on the front page of the student newspaper. The headline read, "University of Denver student and his million-dollar dream." I sat in the silent stacks of the library and read the article, my heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions, a fierce pride warring with an undeniable envy. Julian wasn't just succeeding, he was becoming a campus legend. He was doing it all so effortlessly, as if his success was a foregone conclusion, a destiny that had been pre-written for him. For a moment, I wondered if I was on the wrong path entirely, if my stubborn persistence was just another form of foolishness. 4 years of university flew by in a blur, and Julian and I both graduated with honors. On graduation day, I stood on the field among my classmates, watching my parents in the stands. My mother's face was radiant, her smile beaming with pride. My father, however, just gave a slight formal nod, his expression unreadable. After the ceremony, he walked up to us, clapped Julian firmly on the shoulder, and said, "I'm proud of you, son." Then he turned to me. "Good job, Leo," was all he said. Nothing more, nothing less. I managed to force a smile, but inside a bitter storm was raging. I had worked relentlessly for 4 years to prove myself, but in my father's eyes, I was still just a pale shadow standing next to Julian's brilliance. That evening, during the graduation party at our house, my father summoned Julian and me into his study. He sat behind his imposing mahogany desk, his hands clasped, his expression grave. He looked directly at Julian. "I am going to support you in launching your company," he announced. "I will provide $1 million in seed funding along with legal counsel and strategic advice from my partners." The words hung in the air, a testament to his favor. "You are ready to step into the real world." Julian nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude and excitement. "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down." Then my father's gaze shifted to me. "Leo," he said, his tone flat, "what are your plans?" He didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "Whatever you decide to do, remember what I told you. I will not be supporting you financially. You will have to stand on your own 2 feet just as you've always wanted." I held his gaze, my voice steady and firm. "I'm going to work in the market. I don't need anything from you but myself." He raised a single eyebrow, a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, in his eyes. "Fine," he said, "but don't come to me for a rescue when you fail." I just nodded once, turned and walked out of the room, a strange mix of relief and pain churning in my gut. My father had no faith in me, but it didn't matter anymore. I had faith in myself, and I knew that was all I truly needed. That night I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd had since I was a child. The familiar white walls, the bookshelf overflowing with finance textbooks, the worn wooden desk where I had spent countless hours studying market charts. It all felt like a museum of a life I was about to leave behind. A chapter was closing. I knew with a sudden, absolute clarity that I couldn't stay in this house a moment longer. It wasn't because I hated my father or because I didn't love my mother and Julian. It was because I needed my own air to breathe. I needed space to become the Leo Vance I wanted to be, not the failed version my father saw, and not the faint echo of my brother. The next morning I started packing. It didn't take long. I had an old suitcase, a handful of clothes, my laptop, and a heavy stack of investment books. My mother stood in the doorway of my room, her eyes red and swollen. "Are you sure about this, Leo?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, forcing my own voice to remain steady. "I have to do this, Mom. I can't live here anymore, feeling like I don't belong in my own home." She pulled me into a fierce hug, her warmth enveloping me. "You will always have my love no matter where you go," she whispered into my shoulder. I knew she meant it, but I also knew that her love, as powerful as it was, could no longer bridge the vast canyon between my father and me. My father wasn't there when I left. He was at his office, as always, immersed in the world of multi-million-dollar lawsuits and corporate takeovers. He probably wouldn't even notice I was gone until dinner. His absence wasn't a surprise, but it still sent a sharp, painful pang through my heart. I left a short note on the dining room table. "I'm leaving to find my own path. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for everything." I had no idea if my father would even bother to read it, but I needed to write the words, to mark the official end of that chapter of my life. I found a small apartment for rent in downtown Denver, just a few blocks from the financial district. The place was tiny, barely 400 square feet, with a cramped bedroom, a dilapidated kitchenette, and a single window that overlooked a perpetually noisy street. The paint was peeling in long strips from the walls, and the old wooden floorboards groaned under my feet with every step. But to me, it felt like paradise. For the first time in my 22 years, I had a space that was truly my own, a place where I didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations but my own. The meager savings I'd scraped together from my college jobs would only last a few months. The pressure was on. I knew I had to find work immediately. I polished my resume and sent it out to dozens of securities firms, from massive corporations to small boutique investment funds. But the job market was brutal, and it wasn't particularly kind to a recent graduate with no connections and a thin resume. Most firms were looking for candidates with experience, which I didn't have, or powerful connections, which I stubbornly refused to leverage through my father. I managed to land a few interviews, but they all ended with the same polite, soul-crushing rejection. "You have potential, but we're really looking for someone with more experience." Those first few months in Denver were a grind. My diet consisted of instant noodles and cheap coffee, and my nights were filled with restless, anxiety-fueled sleep. I forced myself to wake up at 5 every morning, plopping down in front of my laptop to analyze the pre-market data, desperately hoping to squeeze a small profit from my tiny investment portfolio. But the market is a fickle beast, and it didn't always cooperate. I remember betting big on an emerging energy company, certain its stock was about to soar. The next day, a devastating analyst report was released and the stock plummeted. I lost nearly $1,000 in a single morning, enough to cover 2 months' rent. I sat there in my cold, empty apartment, staring at the crimson numbers on my screen, feeling like the entire world was laughing at my pathetic attempts. The weight of failure felt suffocating. But then I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and heard my grandfather's voice in my head. "The forest is never easy, Leo, but you have to keep going." After 3 grueling months of relentless searching, I finally got an offer. It was from a small local securities firm called Aspen Ridge Financial. The position was just for an analyst's assistant, and the salary was barely enough to cover my bills, but it was a foothold. It was a start. On my first day, I put on my only suit, an old one that didn't quite fit right anymore, and looked at my reflection in the cheap bathroom mirror. "You can do this, Leo," I said to the tired face staring back at me. The company was located in a sleek, modern glass tower, a hive of activity filled with men and women in expensive suits, all moving with a sense of urgent purpose. I felt completely out of place, like an imposter, but beneath the anxiety was a spark of genuine excitement. This was the world I wanted to be a part of, the arena where I could finally prove what I was made of. The job itself wasn't nearly as glamorous as I had imagined. My days were mostly spent on mundane tasks, entering endless rows of data, running simple financial models, and fetching coffee for the senior analysts. But I was a sponge, soaking up every bit of knowledge I could. I learned how to dissect an earnings report, how to properly assess risk, and most importantly, how to maintain a level head when the market went into a freefall. I worked 14-hour days, often staying late and coming in on weekends just to keep up and show I was serious. My colleagues, most of whom were older and more experienced, initially paid me no mind. But slowly they began to notice that I wasn't just some naive kid playing at finance. They saw my work ethic. One afternoon, while reviewing a report on a tech company, I spotted a critical error in the data, a small miscalculation that had massive implications. I brought it to my boss, a stern, no-nonsense man named Robert. He reviewed my findings, made the correction, and helped the firm sidestep what would have been a significant loss. Later that day, he walked by my desk, clapped me on the shoulder, and said, "Good work, Leo." That simple bit of praise felt like a jolt of electricity, reinforcing my belief that I was finally on the right track. My life gradually found a stable rhythm, but a persistent feeling of emptiness remained. I rarely contacted my family. My mother called me every Sunday, her voice a mix of love and worry, always updating me on Julian's latest triumphs. His startup was flourishing, thanks in no small part to our father's initial investment and the powerful connections he had provided. "Julian just signed a huge new contract," she would say, her voice bursting with pride. "How are you doing, Leo? Are you all right?" I would force a smile into my voice, carefully hiding the bitterness that always crept in. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm doing what I love." But after we hung up, I would sit alone in my dark apartment, wondering if I was just fighting a pointless war, forever chasing Julian's long, successful shadow. I avoided going home, not because I didn't miss my mother, but because I dreaded the inevitable encounter with my father. On the rare occasions I did make the trip, I never stayed for more than a few hours. My father would never ask about my job, limiting our interactions to brief, awkward small talk about the weather or sports. Julian would try to include me in conversations, but I always kept a polite distance. I didn't blame him for his success, but I couldn't bear the feeling of being constantly, if unintentionally, compared to him. Instead of going to my parents' house, I found myself driving up to the mountains to visit my grandparents more and more often. Their small, cozy log cabin tucked away among the towering pine trees was the only place on earth where I felt a true sense of peace. But with each visit, I couldn't help but notice my grandfather was growing more frail. He was still the same tall, proud man, and he still had that warm, genuine smile, but his steps had become slower, more deliberate, and he had developed a persistent cough that worsened in the cold mountain air. My grandmother told me he had a chronic lung condition, a painful legacy from his years working as a ranger in the biting cold. I was deeply worried, but he always waved away my concerns. "Don't you look at me with those sad eyes, Leo," he'd say, his laugh a bit hoarse. "I'm an old man. Getting sick is part of the deal, but I'm so proud of you. You're living an honest life just like I taught you." One afternoon, my grandfather and I were sitting together by the fireplace. The only sound the soft crackling of the logs. His breathing seemed more labored than usual. He told me his old stories, tales of the deep woods and the hard days he'd spent fighting to provide for his family. "You're just like me, Leo," he said, his eyes shining in the firelight. "You have a strong heart, but that also makes it vulnerable. Don't ever let this world make you forget who you really are." I nodded, feeling a profound connection to him, a bond that went deeper than blood. My grandfather wasn't just my family, he was my anchor, my guide. One freezing winter afternoon, while I was buried in work at the office, my grandmother called. Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her. "Leo," she cried, "it's your grandfather. He's very weak. Can you please come?" I dropped everything. I didn't even tell my boss I was leaving. I just grabbed my keys and drove the 3 hours from Denver up into the mountains, my heart pounding with every mile. When I finally arrived, I found my grandfather lying in bed, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and ragged. I rushed to his side and took his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of the fingers that had once taught me how to hold a compass and how to read the signs of the forest. "Grandpa," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. He managed a faint, weak smile. "Don't you cry now, Leo," he rasped. "You're a strong man. Just remember to keep your heart true like I taught you." I nodded, unable to speak, my own heart feeling like it was breaking into a million pieces. A few days later, my father made the decision to have him admitted to the hospital, overriding my grandfather's wishes to stay in his own home. My grandmother, my father, and my mother took turns staying by his side. I drove up every single evening after my long day at the office. About 2 weeks after he was admitted, my grandfather passed away. The night he died, I sat alone by the hospital window, watching the snow fall silently on the city below, feeling as if my entire world had just collapsed. He was the only person who had ever truly believed in me. The only one who saw the person I was, not the person I was supposed to be. Losing him felt like losing a piece of my own soul. The white flakes swirled and danced outside the glass, blanketing the quiet streets of Denver. I wondered if he was out there somewhere in the wind, in the forest, watching over me just as he had when I was a boy. My hand closed around the small wooden wolf he had carved for me when I was 10, a talisman I always kept in my pocket. It was made from a piece of pine, a symbol of resilience and freedom. "You're a wolf, Leo," he had told me when he gave it to me. "Don't you ever let anyone put you in a cage." The days that followed his death were a gray, formless haze. I went back to my job at Aspen Ridge Financial, but I was just going through the motions like a robot. I analyzed the reports. I entered the data. I sat through the meetings, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. Back in that small log cabin in the mountains, listening to my grandfather's raspy laugh, reliving the summer afternoons he taught me how to read the signs left by animals in the dirt. Every time a memory of him surfaced, my chest would seize up, a physical ache that felt like someone was squeezing my heart. 4 days after he died, my grandmother called me. Her voice was thin and frail, but she was clearly trying to sound strong. "Leo, can you come home? We need to prepare for your grandfather's funeral." I took a few days off from work and made the long drive up to the mountains. The familiar road, flanked by towering pines and filled with the clean scent of resin, now felt heavy with an indescribable sorrow. When I pulled up to the cabin, my grandmother was standing on the porch waiting for me. Her eyes were red and swollen, but she still managed a gentle smile. "You're here," she said, pulling me into a tight hug. I held her close, suddenly aware of how fragile she felt in my arms. My grandmother had always been a pillar of strength, but I knew that losing my grandfather meant she was now shouldering an immense and silent pain. The funeral was held in a small, simple church near the edge of the forest. The air was so cold that everyone's breath hung in the air like white clouds. My whole family was there. My mother stood with a somber expression, trying her best to remain composed. Julian was there, dressed in an elegant black suit, his eyes thoughtful and sad. And then there was my father, standing tall and straight, his face a complete mask, devoid of any discernible emotion. Many of the local townspeople came as well, men who had worked alongside my grandfather for decades, people who had sat by his fire and listened to his stories. They came up to me one by one, offering hugs and quiet words of comfort, sharing their own memories of him. The strong ranger, the man who would always lend a hand without ever asking for anything in return. I stood before his open casket, looking at his face one last time. He looked so peaceful, as if he were only sleeping, but I knew with a terrible finality that he was gone forever. I gently placed my hand on his chest and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you for everything." My mother came to stand beside me, her hand gripping mine, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Julian stood just behind us, saying nothing, but I could feel his quiet presence, a silent offering of support. My father, as always, kept his distance, his gaze fixed on some point in the far distance, as if his mind were occupied with matters far more important than his own father's funeral. After the service, our family was summoned to a local lawyer's office for the reading of the will. I didn't have any expectations. As far as I was concerned, my grandfather had already given me the most valuable inheritance possible. His lessons, his stories, and his unwavering belief in me. I figured he would leave the log cabin to my grandmother and whatever small savings he had to the rest of the family. But the moment I stepped into the lawyer's office, a small, cramped room that smelled of old paper and dusty law books, I could feel a strange tension in the air. We all sat around a long, dark wooden table. Me, my mother, my father, Julian, and my grandmother. The silence was thick and heavy. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Hayes, was an elderly gentleman with a shock of white hair and thick, round glasses. He carefully opened a brown, string-tied envelope, and his voice was steady as he began to read. This last will and testament was drafted by Mr. Thomas Vance on October 15, 2020, in the presence of 2 witnesses. My attention drifted, and I found myself staring out the window at the pine branches swaying in the wind, until a single phrase from Mr. Hayes's reading cut through my reverie. The entirety of Mr. Thomas Vance's investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately $5 million, is bequeathed solely to his grandson, Leo Vance. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. My head snapped around, and I felt a dizzying rush of blood to my face. $5 million? My grandfather had an investment portfolio? He had never said a single word about it. I looked desperately at my grandmother, searching for an explanation, but she just offered a small, knowing smile as if this was a secret she had been keeping all along. My mother squeezed my hand tightly, her eyes shining with tears of pride. Across the table, Julian sat ramrod straight, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his face a stiff, unreadable mask. My father's brow furrowed and his icy gaze locked onto Mr. Hayes. "What?" he demanded, his voice sharp and incredulous. "My father had a $5 million portfolio? And you're telling me he left all of it to Leo? Nothing for anyone else?" Mr. Hayes calmly adjusted his glasses, unfazed by my father's outburst, and continued reading from the will. Mr. Vance also left a personal letter for Leo. He slid a small, sealed envelope across the polished surface of the table toward me. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was my grandfather's familiar handwriting, the script strong and clear, yet full of a warmth I could almost feel. "Leo, my grandson, you are the one I trust most in this world. You possess the resilience and the integrity that I have always cherished above all else. This portfolio is the result of my life's work, not something I built for bragging rights, but to secure a future. I know that you will use this gift to create something meaningful, something that honors not just your own ambitions, but the values I have tried to teach you. Don't let anyone sway you from your path. Be the strong wolf you have always been." Tears welled up and fell onto the page, blurring the ink. In that moment, it felt as if my grandfather were right there in the room with me, his hand on my shoulder, still guiding me just as he always had. But when I finally looked up from the letter, I was met with the furious glare of my father. His eyes were a terrifying mix of raw anger and profound disappointment. "This isn't right," he said, his voice as cold and hard as steel. "My father left everything to Leo? To a stubborn kid with absolutely no experience? I am his son. I deserve a share of that inheritance." Julian remained silent, but I saw his hands resting on the table begin to tremble slightly. My mother's grip on my hand tightened, as if she were trying to physically shield me from the storm that was about to break. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, a nervous attempt to diffuse the escalating tension. "This was Mr. Thomas's explicit wish, Mr. Vance. The will was drafted legally with witnesses present. It is legally binding." My father shot up from his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "His wish," he spat. "This is blatant favoritism. Leo is not capable of managing that kind of money. He will squander it. He will ruin everything." I looked straight at my father, the familiar ache in my heart now sharper than ever. "You really think I'm not capable?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "Grandpa believed in me. Why can't you?" My father stared back at me, his gaze like a physical blow. "Because you're not Julian," he said, his voice dripping with years of accumulated bitterness. "You've never been. You don't have the finesse," he continued, his voice rising. "You don't have the vision. You're just a stubborn boy, and my father was a fool to put his faith in you." His words were like a physical assault, each one a sharp blade cutting deep into my heart. My mother rose to her feet, her voice trembling but resolute. "Marcus, that is enough," she said, her voice ringing with an authority I had rarely heard. "Leo is your son, and you should be proud of him just as your father was." My father turned away from us, his back rigid. For a moment I thought I saw his shoulders tremble as if he were fighting some internal battle. It was Julian who finally broke the tense silence. "Congratulations, Leo," he said, his voice calm but icy. "You deserve it." But his eyes told a different story. In them I saw a flash of envy, a flicker of deep hurt, and something that looked terrifyingly like betrayal. I opened my mouth to say something, to try and explain that I had never expected this, that I didn't even know the money existed, but I knew it was pointless. Words were meaningless now. My grandmother, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, slowly rose from her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle but carried an undeniable weight of authority. "Thomas chose Leo because he saw the boy's heart," she said, looking directly at my father. "You may not understand his reasons, but you will respect his decision." She held my father's gaze for a long moment, then looked at Julian, and finally her eyes met mine. "Leo," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you know what you have to do." I nodded, feeling the immense weight of that responsibility settle onto my shoulders. The $5 million wasn't just money. It was my grandfather's entire life's work. It was his legacy, his trust, and a physical manifestation of the values he had worked so hard to instill in me. The meeting ended in a thick, suffocating tension. My father stalked out of the office without another word. My mother gave me a quick, tight hug before hurrying after him. Julian paused, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt strangely cold. "Do well, Leo," he said, his smile strained and unnatural. "Don't let Grandpa down." I nodded, but I knew in that moment that the fragile bonds between me and my brother and between me and my father had been irrevocably fractured. I drove back to Denver with my grandfather's letter tucked safely in my pocket, my mind reeling with a chaotic mix of pride and crushing pressure. I had no idea how to manage such a vast sum of money, but I knew one thing for certain: I could not fail. I sat down in my tiny apartment, opened my laptop, and began the daunting task of studying my grandfather's portfolio. It was a masterpiece of careful, long-term planning. A diverse collection of blue-chip stocks, stable bonds, and a few well-chosen ETFs, all assembled with patience and wisdom over decades. He had built this for me. It was then that I fully understood. My grandfather wasn't just a simple park ranger. He was a brilliant and disciplined investor who had quietly, meticulously amassed a fortune that no one in our family had ever known about. The weeks that followed were a blur of relentless work. By day, I continued my job at Aspen Ridge, absorbing everything I could from the senior analysts. By night, I dedicated myself to studying my grandfather's portfolio, searching for ways to optimize it, to make it grow. I didn't want to just preserve the capital. I wanted to build upon it, to prove that my grandfather's faith in me was not misplaced. But the pressure wasn't just professional. My father called me several times, his voice always cold and demanding, insisting that I had a moral obligation to share the inheritance with the rest of the family. "It's not just your money, Leo," he'd say, his voice laced with contempt. "It belongs to the whole family. You can't be this selfish." I refused every time, not because I was greedy, but because I felt a sacred duty to honor my grandfather's final wishes. "Grandpa left it to me, Dad," I would reply, my voice steady. "I will not betray his trust." One evening I drove up to the mountains, a bouquet of wildflowers in my hand to place on my grandfather's grave. I stood before the simple stone marker, the cold wind whispering through the pines, and I felt his presence all around me. "Grandpa," I whispered to the wind. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this, but I promise you I will give it everything I have. A single tear traced a cold path down my cheek, but alongside the grief I felt a new strength hardening within me. My grandfather had believed in me, and I would not let him down. 4 years have passed since my grandfather died, leaving me with not just a $5 million inheritance, but also the immense responsibility to transform that legacy into something truly meaningful. Those 4 years were a crucible, a relentless test of my will and my spirit. There were countless nights I stayed awake until dawn, my eyes burning from staring at my computer screen, analyzing hundreds of financial reports, desperately trying to predict market trends, and constantly wondering if I had what it took to keep my promise to my grandfather. There were moments I felt certain I would collapse, times when the market crashed and wiped out weeks of gains, times when the pressure from my family became almost unbearable. But every single time I felt myself start to give up, I would pull out my grandfather's letter and read his powerful grounding words. Be the strong wolf you have always been. And I would find the strength to keep fighting. I knew I couldn't just park the money in a savings account or stick to safe, low-yield investments. My grandfather hadn't entrusted me with his life's work, so I could simply preserve it. He wanted me to build something. He hadn't left me this fortune so I could live an easy, comfortable life. He wanted me to create something great, just as he had written in his letter. I realized that to truly honor his legacy, I would have to take bigger, more calculated risks. I had to be smarter, bolder. I didn't just want to protect the wealth he had given me, I wanted to multiply it, to provide irrefutable proof that his faith in me had not been in vain. I kept my job at Aspen Ridge Financial, continuing to learn the complex intricacies of the market from the seasoned professionals around me. But I knew I couldn't remain an analyst's assistant forever, executing someone else's vision. I began to dream of starting my own investment fund, a place where I could make my own decisions, support innovative new ideas, and create real, tangible value in the world. The idea started as a whisper and grew into a roar. After nearly 3 years of relentless work and disciplined investing, I had managed to grow the initial $5 million portfolio to $10 million. Thanks to a few significant, well-timed investments in a lithium battery manufacturer and a promising AI software startup. This early success gave me a much-needed boost of confidence, but it also brought a new level of intense pressure. I knew I couldn't afford to stop now. I wasn't just doing this for my grandfather anymore, I was doing it for myself to prove that I could succeed on my own terms, without my father's help, without anyone's approval. At the end of my 3rd year, I made the terrifying decision to leave my stable job at Aspen Ridge and start my own fund. I named it Vance Capital, a quiet tribute to the man who had made it all possible. I rented a small office in downtown Denver, a space just big enough for 3 people. Me, my co-founder, a brilliant analyst named Olivia whom I'd met at my old firm, and a sharp young assistant named Chloe. We launched with a clear mission to support small visionary startups with a special focus on companies dedicated to sustainability and social innovation. I wanted Vance Capital to be more than just a profit-making machine. I wanted it to be a legacy of real value, a reflection of the principles my grandfather had taught me. The first few months were a brutal test of our resilience. I had to go out and find investors myself, pitching our vision to people with decades more experience, competing for capital against much larger, more established funds. Some of those meetings ended in blunt, painful rejections. "You're too young, Leo," they'd say. "Your fund has no track record. Why should we trust you with our money?" But I refused to give up. I just kept pushing. I would think back to those long-ago days when my grandfather would lead me deep into the forest, teaching me that the most difficult paths often lead to the most beautiful, rewarding places. So I refined our strategy. I sought out the most promising and overlooked startups, and I slowly, painstakingly, began to build a reputation for integrity and insight. Gradually, Vance Capital started to gain traction. A small startup we had invested in, a company that produced innovative recycled building materials, won a major national award, which brought a flood of positive media attention. An article in a national business journal described Vance Capital as a young fund with a far-reaching vision, and suddenly I started receiving calls and partnership offers from the very same major investors who had dismissed me just a year earlier. By the end of our 4th year in operation, our fund's portfolio had grown to over $30 million, a number I wouldn't have even dared to dream of when I first started this journey. But more important than the money was the profound sense of pride I felt in having built something from the ground up, something that was entirely my own, something that no one could ever take away from me. Throughout those 4 intense years, I maintained a careful distance from my family. It wasn't because I didn't love them. It was because I needed to protect my own heart, to shield myself from the old dynamics that had caused me so much pain. My father eventually stopped calling to demand I share the inheritance, but our conversations were still fraught with tension. Whenever we spoke, he would inevitably bring up Julian, subtly but relentlessly comparing our achievements. Julian just opened a new branch office in Dallas, he announced during one of the rare family dinners I forced myself to attend. His company is expanding very quickly. How are things with you, Leo? I would offer a polite, faint smile and a vague reply. I'm doing well, Dad. My work is going fine. I never shared any specific details. I refused to give him the ammunition to view my life through the lens of Julian's success, or to judge me based on his narrow definition of what I should be doing. My mother was the only one I stayed in regular contact with. She called me every week, sent me care packages filled with homemade cookies, and always asked with genuine interest about how things were going at Vance Capital. "You make me so proud, Leo," she told me once, her voice warm and sincere over the phone. "I always knew you would do great things." Her unwavering belief was like a soothing balm on the old, tender wounds in my heart. I also made a point to visit my grandmother often, bringing fresh flowers from my grandfather's grave and sitting with her for hours just listening to her stories about him. She was growing noticeably frailer with each passing year, but her eyes would still light up with that familiar sparkle whenever she looked at me. "You are Thomas's pride and joy," she'd say, her hand gently squeezing mine. "Don't you ever forget that." Julian, meanwhile, continued to shine brightly in his own world. At least that's how it appeared from the outside. His startup, the app connecting businesses with investors, had successfully raised tens of millions of dollars in venture capital funding. My father never missed an opportunity to boast about Julian at family gatherings, grandly anointing him as the true heir to the Vance family legacy. But I heard a different story from my mother. In our private conversations, she confided that Julian was struggling. He had expanded his company far too quickly, driven more by ambition than by a sound, long-term vision, and some of his key investors were starting to get nervous and pull their funding. I didn't take any pleasure in hearing this news, but I can't say I was surprised. Julian had always been a master at crafting a perfect public image, but he had always relied too heavily on our father's money and connections instead of learning how to face and overcome challenges on his own. One crisp autumn afternoon, while I was in my office at Vance Capital reviewing the file of a promising new startup, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Leo, your father wants to see you," she said, her voice strained with a familiar worry. "He says it's important." A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. "What's it about, Mom?" She hesitated for a moment. I'm not entirely sure, but it has something to do with Julian. His company is in serious trouble. I fell silent, feeling the distant rumble of an approaching storm. I'll be there, I said, though my entire body recoiled at the thought of the confrontation that was surely waiting for me. That evening, I drove to the old house in Cherry Hills Village. The mansion looked exactly the same, with its massive glass windows glowing with warm golden light, but it had long since stopped feeling like a home to me. I found my father in his study, sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk. Julian was there too, slumped in one of the leather armchairs. He looked exhausted, older than I had ever seen him. He was still handsome, but the confident, radiant spark that had always animated his eyes was gone. My mother hovered near the doorway, watching me with a look of deep concern. My father wasted no time on pleasantries. He got straight to the point. "Leo," he began, his voice flat and businesslike, "Julian's company needs a significant capital infusion. A major investor just pulled out and we need to fill the gap immediately." He looked at me then, and for the first time in my life I saw something other than cold disapproval in his eyes. It was a flicker of something that looked almost like a plea. "You have Vance Capital now. You have the resources. You can help your brother." I looked from my father to Julian, my heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "You want me to invest in Julian's company?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter and sharper than I intended. Julian finally spoke, his voice raspy and strained. "Leo, I know we haven't been close for a long time, but I really need your help. This company is everything to me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the raw desperation in his eyes. A part of me, the part that still remembered the little boy I had built forts with, wanted to help him without a second thought. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime enduring my father's blatant favoritism and the endless, exhausting comparisons to my brilliant twin, could not stay silent. "Julian, I don't blame you for any of this," I began, my voice steady. "But you had Dad. You had his money, his connections. You had every advantage that I never had. And now, when it all falls apart, you want me to come in and save you? Do you really think that's fair to me?" My father's hand came down hard on the desk, the sound echoing through the quiet room. "Leo, this is not the time to be selfish," he roared, his face contorted with fury. "This is about family. You inherited $5 million from my father, and you can't spare a little of it to help your own brother?" I stood my ground, looking him straight in the eye. "That money isn't yours, and it isn't the family's. It is Grandpa's legacy, and he entrusted it to me. I have grown it with my own sweat and my own effort, and I don't owe anyone a single dime of it." The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with years of unspoken resentment ready to explode. My mother stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Leo, please, calm down. We can talk about this." But I just shook my head, turning my attention back to Julian. "I will introduce you to a top-tier financial advisor," I said, my voice softening slightly. "They can help you restructure your company, find a path forward, but I cannot invest, Julian. It's time for you to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, just like I had to." Julian nodded slowly, his eyes a confusing mix of gratitude and deep personal hurt. My father just stared at me, his face a mask of profound disappointment. "You are not the man I thought you were, Leo," he said, his voice quiet now, but no less cutting. I allowed myself a small, weary smile. "I don't need you to think I'm anyone, Dad. I finally know who I am." I walked out of that house and into the cool night air, feeling a strange and unsettling combination of profound relief and deep, aching pain. I had made the choice to protect my grandfather's legacy, and in doing so, to protect myself. But I knew with a heavy heart that I had just severed what little remained of my connection to my family. On the long drive back to Denver, I found myself pulling over on the side of a dark, empty road that bordered a state forest. I got out of the car and just stood there for a long time under a vast, star-filled sky. The night wind carried the familiar, comforting scent of pine. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could almost feel my grandfather standing beside me, a proud smile on his face. "I'm doing the right thing, Grandpa," I whispered into the darkness. "I promise I'll keep going." Over the past 4 years, I haven't just grown my grandfather's wealth. I have grown into myself. Vance Capital isn't just an investment fund. It is my declaration of independence, living proof that I can stand on my own, in spite of my father's doubts, in spite of my complicated rivalry with Julian, in spite of all the challenges life has thrown my way. I have finally become the wolf my grandfather always knew I could be. Strong, honest, and at long last free. And now, as I sit here telling the story of my life, with all of its scars and its moments of pride, I hope that somewhere in my struggle you might find a small spark of your own inspiration. I don't expect anyone to follow my exact path, but I do hope you find the courage to be unapologetically yourself, the resilience to weather the inevitable storms, and the unwavering faith to walk the road you choose no matter how difficult or lonely it may become. Live with the integrity of a wolf in the forest and never ever let anyone extinguish the fire in your heart.